Sounds good.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Prudent Reads number 5. I am joined today with the ever so wonderful Mr. Patriarch. Mr. Patriarch, how are you doing today?
Finer than frog hair, my friend. I just applied for a new job, and hopefully come Tuesday I'll hear back on that. So feeling hopeful, feeling good, and yeah, everything's going fine.
Well, I'm glad to hear it, and thank you for stopping by and joining us today. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So today we decided that since Mr. Patriarch has been making a wonderful series of videos, which you can find on his channel, which I've linked in the description, we decided that now would be the best time to go over the timeless works of Niccolo Machiavelli. In his best known work besides Discourses is The Prince. And of course, for those of you who are unfamiliar, The Prince, of course, is a series of, I guess you could almost call it a proto self-help how-to manual, sort of the mirror kind of texts of the Renaissance and late Middle Ages, of sort of to provide political instruction as to how to govern. And, for those who are more into the interests of, say, realism or realpolitik, Machiavelli is sort of the first person that gets cited quite often and takes a lot of influence, as Zachary points out in chat, from the Republic, from the ancient Greek works. So, Mr. Patriarch, you've been working on, a series of videos discussing The Prince and the various chapters inside. What do you find the most timeless about Machiavelli's work?
Well, one of the things that I found really interesting, because I had read The Prince first back in my university days, longer ago than I think now at this point. And I, at the time, I was kind of, it was just one of those texts that we read, and I didn't pay much attention to it. But when I wanted to start this series, I sort of reread The Prince again in advance, and I was just struck by how modern it sounds. So just the tone of the text itself. I mean, it sounds very. It's actually quite a gripping, pretty entertaining read, particularly as far as works of political philosophy are concerned. It's really it's a page turner. You can really easily spend a lot of time. And I remember when I finished the book, I just sort of sat under a tree while my wife and son were taking a nap, and just sort of tore through the last part of it. And it really it lends itself to easy reading while being chock full of information. The format of many short chapters I find personally appealing, because it's sort of one of those psychological things where you want to see what goes next. And if you're dealing with a particular chapter that's maybe dragging or a little bit dense, you don't have long to wait until you get onto something new and fresh. And every topic is and every chapter is topical. And it's just I'd recommend it for that aspect alone. It's very, even now, all these hundreds of years later, still a very entertaining book to read, particularly on politics.
Yes, and I do have a audiobook version sort of linked in the description. If you are familiar with the YouTube channel that I've linked it into, then you'll enjoy the voice who's reading it. And if not, well, don't worry, there's a million other channels out there that are doing it. But it's there in the description if you haven't read it recently. Like you, I also read it in college quite a few years back as sort of my introduction to like realism and realpolitik. Who's been studying like international affairs and relations. I always took a more realist approach to things. I understood, the perspectives of, say, things like Machiavelli, like that of Henry Kissinger, more recently with people like John J. Mearsheimer and others. So I think that it's important to recognize that we don't live in a perfect world. And Machiavelli is very clear to point out that virtue, or what he would describe as sort of liberality, which of course is not to be confused with, say, liberalism, there's a time and a place for it, and that it's important to act in a way that, it's better to be, if you appear to be merciful, or if you appear to be kind and generous, that will be taken advantage against you. And it's important to be swift in your ability to put down, or, either rebellion, or to maintain a siege, or in the defense of your people. Which I think is a really good way to start when we talk about the Prince, because the first thing that we really talk about when you open up the book itself is sort of a discussion of what kind of princedoms or kinds of governments that are out there. He sort of talks about really 4 aspects of, states or principalities. And I found that the most interesting, because it's such a applicable thing to its time. Is they're either kingdoms or republics, although he does mention that there's sort of a religious republic in reference to the papal states. But even then, 500 years ago, we're still dealing with those kinds of aspects of government. You either have sort of a demos, a democracy, or you have some form of a central authority, either a king or a prince, or that kind of central oligarchical kind of way of ruling. And I just find it funny that, 500 years later, we're still talking about there's really 2 kinds of government that exist here, when, either some sort of demos, or some sort of the people, or, a strong central authority with a bureaucracy.
Yeah, no, that's true. Now, and before I dip into that, I just wanted to, sorry guys, I ate a bunch of chicken before this. I'm clearing my throat here, a bit of phlegm. But one of the things that I think Machiavelli gets misunderstood by, is he's sort of cast as an amoralist. But what you were touching on there, I think is important, because I think it would be wrong to say he's an amoralist, because what I definitely get reading the text is that a king should try to be virtuous and whatnot, but sometimes in order to rule, you need to be a son of a bitch a little bit, right? And you're dealing with people who aren't virtuous. And so to be, to bring a knife to a gunfight, so to speak, as a ruler, it's not only going to be bad for you, but it could probably prove to be bad for your kingdom as well. So I think that's one thing. And so he's on the moral angle, he's realistic about what is possible. So Machiavelli's all about what is possible. And it's possible, according to Machiavelli, essentially to be both a good king and at times ruthless, or of dubious moral character in certain circumstances. So now, as far as the types of government that you talked about, that's probably the one I've spent the most amount of time on in my series so far. So Machiavelli goes into quite a bit of length describing the different types of government that exist. Now, he doesn't spend a lot of time in The Prince discussing republics. He goes into that in he mentions that he goes into it in other works that he's written. But the 2 types of government that he spends most amount of time on are 2 different forms of monarchies. And the first type of monarchy he cites is what he calls essentially the French model. And what he means by the French model is that there is one monarch over the kingdom who rules as the sovereign, but underneath of him, there is a nobility class who has their own hereditary rights and privileges, and people beneath them who are loyal to them first, and then to the king above. So, your barons, your dukes, and all that sort of stuff. And the second model that he cites is the more centralized approach, which he calls basically the Turkish model. And what this is it's a type of monarchy where you have one centralized ruler who rules through magistrates, essentially. So this is what you would find, in China, in parts of China, in Turkey, probably, not entirely, but a bit more so in somewhere like Russia. So Russia, of course, had nobility, but by the end of the empire, the Tsar was, had much more autocratic power than certain other rulers had to contend with, say, in the Middle Ages. So those are the two big types of monarchies he's talking about. And the strengths and weaknesses of each he goes to in great detail. So the strength of the centralized Turkish model, as he calls it, is that there is unity of direction. So the emperor or the king is able to, because he's the sole source of sovereignty within the nation or the empire, he's able to direct all of his forces and sort of centrally command powers and sort of engage in warfare, stuff like that. And this makes it difficult to invade because there are no competing noble factions who are peeved off with the regime who the invader could sort of get on side to help overthrow. So in this sense, the centralized Turkish model is superior, according to Machiavelli. But inversely, while the fractured French model, as he calls it, with the competing noble factions under a king is easier to take via invasion, is much harder to hold, for the simple reason that you do have all these competing sources of sovereignty within the country. And if you don't make them happy, or if you try to liquidate them, it's going to cause you a lot of problems, and you're going to have a hell of a time trying to hold on to power. So is there anything you'd like to add there, Prudentialist? I'm going to have another sip of my beverage here.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I mean, he talks about both, what he calls like a mixed principality or hereditary principality in those two chapters when he's sort of diving into the differences between, say, the French or Turkish model in regards to having a feudal noble class of barons and an oligarch, or a wealthy landed gentry versus a rather centralized sovereign that has its direction going in whatever the direction the sovereign wants. Which is funny because he immediately starts talking about, well, how do you conquer or how do you take care of those kind of two principalities if you're going to take over, if you're going to rule them? And so to move ahead, when we're talking about the difficulties of holding on to, say, like a French model, he talks about this in chapter 8. Where he talks about, criminal virtue, the idea of which a prince is securing his power through cruel, immoral deeds, usually through like killing political rivals. And he talks about, two rather important references. Of course, this is heavily based on, Italian politics at the time, and of course, Roman and ancient Greek history. I think he mentions Agathocles of Syracuse. I'm probably butchering that, but like he becomes the praetor of Syracuse. Right. And he calls this meeting of all the senators, and he kills them all with his troops.
Agathocles of Syracuse. Yeah.
Real son of a bitch. Real tough guy, real evil dude. Goes in but he kills the entire oligarchy, the landed gentry, the wealthy, and the senators of Syracuse at the time, and destroying all of the old money. So you can now effectively rule without opposition. To which Machiavelli writes, so secure was his power that he could afford to absent himself to go on and campaign in, say, like the African states. So Machiavelli then states that his behavior was not simply virtue. He says, one cannot call it virtue to kill one's citizens, betray one's friends, to be without faith, without mercy, without religion. These modes can enable one to acquire an empire, but not glory. Nonetheless, his savage cruelty and inhumanity, together with his infinite crimes, did not permit him to be celebrated amongst most excellent men. Thus, one cannot attribute to fortune or virtue what he achieved without either. And I do find it interesting, though, because a lot of people, and I think this may come from both like the church as well. I mean, both the Catholics and the Protestants have issues with Machiavelli, and they call him sort of this anti-Christian. But I mean, it's not that Machiavelli's without a sense of moral code, and he definitely understands that at least men of his time, right, are recognized by their glory, they're recognized how they are treated and remembered by others. And cruelty, while it can accomplish quite a great deal of things, whether that's securing your power or taking out rivals, it does prevent you from leaving behind a legacy. Which is interesting, because when we talk about legacy in politics these days, it's very much about, what do you do? Or do we remember the ruthless? Do we not? And I think history does remember the ruthless to a significant degree, even in our more, watered down sense of the word here in, say, the West. Like, I would consider a ruthless leader would be, for example, like Lyndon Baines Johnson here in the U.S. I have a lot of issues with LBJ, but I can't say that LBJ wasn't an effective leader in his ability to be ruthless in the U.S. Senate to get legislation passed. So I do find it interesting that, he does have a sense of a moral code, but at the same time, I find it interesting that he's so adamant to dissuade individuals from acting with this sort of cruelty or this aspect of glory. Fortune and virtue are still these very valued items in Machiavelli's view.
No, you're right. And this sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier with he's not entirely without morals. I think that's a mischaracterization of his position. But yes, he recognized what he does in The Prince is he shows the various ways by which power can be gained. And Agathocles was given as an example of someone who is able to get power through crime, essentially. Now, Agathocles himself, if I'm recalling correctly from The Prince, he was he basically elevated himself as a nobody to becoming commander of the military of Syracuse through his ability. But then, as you say, he summoned everybody together and then killed them. And as there was no competing sources of legitimacy or wealth in Syracuse anymore, he was able to rule unimpeded. There's another guy he gives an example of, who was what was that guy's name? Of Fermo, the city of Fermo. Crap, I can't remember his name. It's an excellent story though, but it's a similar sort of thing. And Machiavelli uses this other character as another example of someone who is able to achieve power through crime. And this guy of the dictator of Fermo, what happened was he started off as an orphan who was raised by his uncle, who was a well-to-do man about Fermo city in Italy. And what ended up happening is he rose through the ranks of the army, and then he got in contact with somebody who was let's say a discontented elite, a rogue elite of the nefarious sort within Fermo. And in conjunction with this guy, he got very much like Agathocles, he got all the great and good of Fermo together in one place. And he executed Order 66 on their butts and just slaughtered them all. But of course, what ended up happening is while he was, up to his own shenanigans, he was sort of a servant of Cesare Borgia, who was kind of the most ruthless, infamous ruler at the time in Italy. And then eventually Cesare Borgia is like, well, I don't know if I can trust this guy, and it'll be good for me if I get rid of him. So he actually had this guy in Fermo, the dictator of Fermo, and his contact in the city both strangled. So it's kind of just desserts for them, I suppose. But you see this all throughout The Prince. Machiavelli, he's not really interested in showing the right or wrong of the various ways of getting power. He's interested in showing someone how they can get power. And it's illustrative too, because let's suppose his audience was to, say the wise king or whatever, the noble lord. If, he reads Machiavelli and he hears these terrible stories, if nothing else, he sort of knows what to look out for, right? And the various ways in which his power can be threatened. So in that sense, I can see these illustrative examples of no good nicks, as cautionary tales for the wise king, essentially.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, anyone who understands sort of like the basic premises of, say, realism or, say, offensive realism, as we've talked about on this channel, is that the world is inherently a chaotic place, and that people are looking out for themselves, and that they're going to be very much vested in their self-interest and self-preservation. And so there's a lot in which Machiavelli offers in The Prince that discusses the need to not only like please people, but understand that, you know, you can't get anything accomplished unless you can secure wealth and you can secure power. And so, you know, anyone who is a prince who is going to rule over a part of land, and he talks about this, I think primarily, I want to say, in chapters 14 and 15, where he talks about that, you know, princes need to study war. Princes need to understand that your ability to wage war and your ability to maintain a military that's standing, that is of its native-born population, and you can maintain a siege or hold off a siege, is going to allow you to hold on to that power. And he spends a lot of time saying that, listen, a good prince knows how to hunt, who knows how to be in his physical prowess and prime, and can lead soldiers into battle if necessary. You can't lead from behind. There's this aspect of, you know, putting on a good image of what a leader is in comparison to, say, someone who leads from the rear. And there's a lot that deals with just how you project yourself, all at the same time having the actual capacity to project power as well.
Yeah, definitely. And he spends a decent amount of time about appearances. So what you were saying, he does want the ruler to possess, you know, certain virtues, obviously, hopefully in part by having the good sense to read Sir Machiavelli. But these aspects of sort of not showing cowardice, like you say, leading from the front, showing decisiveness, and also rewarding your friends and being loyal to your friends. He's also sort of big on that. One of the things that he talked about is when you take a new territory, one of the things that you'll do is, if you have people who are loyal to you, you want to be, I think the exact words he says, be swift to punish, but slow to issue favors, so lands and titles and so forth. And the benefit to that is the advice he gave to the conquering ruler is to be as ruthless as you need to be initially, but once you're sort of in power, try to ingratiate yourself to the people you need to, right? So to the common folk, he's a big advocate of having the common folk on your side. And that's important to Machiavelli, not so much because, you know, their vote matters, so to speak, but because if he needs to call upon them for military service or to defend the throne, ultimately they're the ones who are going to be, you know, putting their necks out there for the sovereign. So for that reason, Machiavelli is very big about ingratiating yourself to the people. But where he's much more leery and where he sees the real threat to a sovereign's power is from the nobility, from noble factions or from merchant factions. And so it's always a bit of a challenge trying to deal with these people in The Prince from Machiavelli's perspective, because on the one hand, for the not the republics, but for the kingdoms where you have, based on the French model, where you have these competing nobilities, you can't afford to get rid of them, but they're the ones who are going to be the biggest threat to your authority. So in order to stave that off, you need to get the nobles that you can on side and friendly to you and working for you, and try to make the balancing act so that it's both in the nobles, or at least the majority of the nobles, and in the people's best interest for you to stay atop the throne. But where things get much dicier, according to Machiavelli, isn't so much in ruling a kingdom that you inherit. Where things get really hard to hard to sort of hold together is when you're conquering new territory. And that is where he sees the biggest issues for the would-be prince. And one of the reasons why Machiavelli wrote this treatise, The Prince, is because Italy at the time had been sort of divided and invaded by French and Holy Roman Empire forces from the north. And they had, in fact, been invited in by these competing Italian states. So what Machiavelli wanted was to basically unified kingdom of Italy for the purposes of, kicking out the dirty foreigners. And what he was hoping is that the Medici ruler of Florence that he was writing this to might be such a one to hopefully unify Italy. Now, of course, that would only happen a few centuries earlier, but the practicalities of conquest were forefront in Machiavelli's mind for the specific reason of Italian unification. So, you got anything to add there, man?
Yeah, a couple of things. So, when we talk about keeping the nobles happy, Machiavelli, he just spent quite a few time. I know in chapters 10 as well as chapters 7, there's a lot of conversation about the importance of having, these almost, I wouldn't say elite backing, but necessarily the ability to have a group of people loyal to your command. And that's the way that can help you maintain power, but is also stave off, the issues around being conquered, or to have the population that you've recently conquered, or even your own territory, be at your back. I know in chapter 10, he talks about this a lot when he talks about measuring the defense of one's kingdom. And he's very adamant about making sure that your public appearance and your relationship to those around you is important. And I know he writes, quote, "Therefore, one who becomes a prince through favor of the people ought to keep them friendly, as this he can easily do by seeing only that they ask not to be oppressed by him. But one who, in opposition to the people, becomes a prince by the favor of the nobles, ought to, above everything, seek to win the people over to himself. And this may easily do so if he takes them under his protection. Because men, when they receive good from him of whom they were expecting evil, are bound closely to their benefactor. Thus the people quickly become more devoted to him than if they had been raised to the principality by their favors, and the prince can win their affections in many ways." End quote. And I find that just interesting, because it's just, there's so much about that public appearance and that maintaining the concern of both the people and the nobles around him, to a point where he's talking about defending his own city or defending the principality. He says, "Therefore, a prince who has a strong city and has not made himself odious will not be attacked. Or if one should attack him, he will only be driven off with disgrace. Again, because that the affairs of this world are so changeable, it is almost impossible to keep an army a whole year in the field without being interfered with." And I find just there's a lot of attention that Machiavelli gives to the importance of both public appearance, making sure that those who are in charge can rule effectively, but at the same time, that old adage about it's easier to attract flies or bees with honey than it is vinegar. And I just feel like that there's a lot of all of these sort of what we would consider truisms about public relations and governance. A lot of it spans back to Machiavelli and the Roman and Greek examples that he cites throughout the book.
No, definitely. And one of the interesting things about it, I find, is the psychologizing that Machiavelli does. So that passage you just read is sort of one of my favorite parts, where Machiavelli says that when the people basically think you're, oh, get ready, here comes the jackboot. Oh, this isn't going to be nice. But then you're actually nice to them. Then they're much more happy than if they were your allies from the start. Which is, if you start sort of thinking about the mental effects there at work, I think it's kind of because in Machiavelli's mind, you want to be feared but sort of loved at the same time. So if the people are sort of afraid of you at first, but then you sort of show that you're able to be benevolent and fair, then they're perhaps oddly more ingratiated to you with time. And one thing that he also mentions is that you don't want to escalate tensions by not being ruthless enough. And what he means by that, and it has specifically to do with public opinion, like what you were saying, is when you take a new territory, or if you're newly come to power and there's a bit of a power struggle from within the kingdom, you got to be a real hard ass about it and do whatever you got to do to put that down. Because what you don't want to do, and this goes back to the public relations thing, is you don't want to be in a position where you appear weak and also are reacting sort of in escalating stages of violence, trying to sort of deal with this issue, because that will make you hated over time. So Machiavelli's best advice is tear the Band-Aid off, and then hopefully, it's over, instead of, slowly trying to peel it off and, just taking the scab off with it. That's sort of the antithesis of Machiavelli's advice. Machiavelli's advice is decisiveness, be feared, but hopefully loved at the same time, and respected, and don't sort of drag things out trying to be, Mr. Nice Guy, because that will not only is dangerous for you because you still have the noble factions against you, but the people actually resent that. Now, Prudentialist, I was wondering, would you be willing to sort of introduce our audience to what Machiavelli holds up as sort of one of the paragons of the effective prince, Cesare Borgia?
Oh boy, the Borgias. Now, I mean, despite the as much as the media likes to provide for what the Borgias were, no, Machiavelli uses the Borgias as like the sort of primo Italian example of effective.
This is what you should do. Yeah.
This is what you should do. But keep in mind, though, before I get into the Borgias, and we'll spend some time talking about them, that this is written sort of to the family, of course, the Medici's family, which, of course, if you know any part of your Italian politics and who becomes who, you've got, I think it's Pope Leo X, who's of that family, and so there's a lot in which he gives his attention to, and the book is dedicated to that. Which, and to transition now into the Borgias, is that I think it's important we talk about how to rule, that we refer to sort of the opening chapters of The Prince, because this is where, he'd spend so much time talking about governance and leadership, but it's the importance of talking about adding to older states, or to states that have already had their own laws and orders. And he sort of gives these examples about, what you need to do in order to rule effectively. You keep the state intact and you install your own rich oligarchical buddies. You destroy them as Rome destroyed Carthage. Or, you go there and you live there yourself and rule it personally if you have to do it yourself. And so that brings us now, of course, talking about Borgia, because we talk about how to rule, and we talk about how it's important to be effective in that kind of leadership. And this is where Cesare Borgia is brought up as this prince that is the guy to go to. He's considered a lucky prince who is conquest by fortune and comes through. And he talks about there are two types of people that rule, either those who get through their own skill, or though through the luck and the blessings of powerful figures and such as family or the regime falling apart. And he mentions Cesare Borgia as an example of a lucky prince, through cunning political maneuvering, securing his own power, made commanders of the papal armies by his father, Pope Alexander VI, but at the same time relied on mercenary armies with the support of the French. And in doing so, he's this guy that, helped rule over parts of France and made himself to seek new alliances. And he's sort of this example he brings about in chapter 7.
Yeah. No, Cesare Borgia was one of the examples Machiavelli gave of a ruler who won his throne by luck. And the reason for that is Cesare Borgia was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI. And Alexander VI had eyes on expanding papal authority and influence in the Italian peninsula. And one of the ways that he did this is he couldn't. So he felt Pope Alexander VI felt that he couldn't expand the papal states directly through force of arms. So what he ended up doing is he granted a papal bull of divorce, I believe, to King Charles IV, I think, of France, for an annulment of his marriage, for divorce. And in return for this, the King of France granted his son Cesare, I believe, a lordship within France. And then he was able to sort of use this as a springboard to bigger and better things. So what Pope Alexander did in conjunction with Cesare Borgia is they were able to invade parts of the surrounding territories around the papal states. And what they were primarily interested in was the taking of Romagna. I think I'm saying that correctly, which was a region to the northeast of Rome. And so with the backing of certain French elements and Cesare Borgia's own army and some of the military backing of the papal states directly, they're able to seize an incredible amount of territory. And Cesare Borgia, not Cesare, but his father, Pope Alexander VI, had to also contend with rival factions within Rome itself. And one of the things Machiavelli does is he sort of outlines how in the papal I don't want to offend any Catholics here, but this is Machiavelli talking. But in the papal election process, there's quite a bit of politicking that goes around. And with the noble families in Rome, there were two different main factions. I think the Orsinis and do you remember the name of the other one? Prudentialist?
I know it's the Orsinis and the
Orsinis.
Oh man, I'm trying to remember now. I think he had a henchman, right? It's Ramiro de Orco, right?
Yeah. It was the Orsinis and Colonna, I think.
Okay.
Colonna. But what Pope Alexander had to deal with was these competing factions within Rome, because the problem is they sort of served as a check internally within Rome upon sort of what the Pope was able to do. And what made Pope Alexander VI notable to Machiavelli was his ability to put down these competing noble houses. And one of the things that, like what you were saying, Prudentialist, with Cesare Borgia, and this sort of goes to his his evil brilliance, was he was not above using cat's paws to dispense his evil doing and then sort of liquidate them after. So you want to tell them about that juicy story about De Orco?
Yeah, we can. Because I mean, he spends a lot of time talking about that, the cruelty and De Orco and all that. In chapter 17, where we're talking about cruelty and mercy, he says that his cruelty and his swiftness protected him from rebellions, because those who can't put down a rebellion, or those who can't put down those that would betray you, are going to be plotting against you, and you're not going to last very long. And so I think one of your videos talks about this part, right? About De Orco and what happens there.
Yeah. So what ended up happening with De Orco is that Cesare Borgia had a certain amount of lawlessness within the territories that he had recently conquered, from nobles, common folk, whoever. And what he did was he hired this hard ass De Orco to basically sort things out. And De Orco did so within a very short amount of time by being incredibly brutal and becoming hated by everybody. Now, what Cesare Borgia did is he's like, I like the results, but the methods got my new territory mad at me. So what he ended up So what he ended up doing was he had De Orco decapitated in the middle of the city and had his head put on a block for everybody to see, to sort of make an example out of him. So this sort of evil, cunning brilliance where he does the dirty deeds that need to get done, but then he's able to wash his hands clean in the public eyes afterwards. And this is sort of something that you would see similar in the Stalinist purges. So during Yezhovshchina, Stalin had his head of the NKVD, Yezhov, basically, going around killing tons of people and purging this guy, that, and the other. And everybody was, terrified and upset at the end of it. And at the end, when the purge was all over and Stalin had gotten rid of his enemies, and Yezhov had also been a little bit maybe overzealous, perhaps, Stalin was like, "Oh, Yezhov, this bad guy. I'm sorry. Like, we'll deal with Yezhov. Don't you worry." And so Stalin was able to pin everything on Yezhov at the end of it, in much the same way that Cesare Borgia was to do with De Orco as well. So that again goes back to what Machiavelli's always harping about, which is public perception. How does the nobility perceive you? How do the common folk perceive you? And how can you turn that to your advantage while still achieving your objectives?
Yeah, and I mean, it's the importance to have that fine balance between being seen as cruel and being effective in what you're doing, but at the same time, that appearance of being merciful. And that's what I find so interesting about this book, and why it's so timeless to me, at least, right? Is because it's important that you understand that, you have to be pragmatic. You can't allow yourself to be a pushover, while at the same time that commitments made in peace are not always kept in adversity. Commitments made in fear are kept out of fear. A prince must ensure that he is not feared to the point of hatred, but feared out of the point in which he can effectively, dispense with his word and be able to keep it. So for those who are familiar with, Machiavelli and the Prince especially, you'll know that chapter 17, Cruelty versus Mercy, is one of the most sort of important chapters of the work, because it's the importance of how do you maintain that public appearance, how do you maintain the loyalty of those around you, and how can you ensure that those who are in charge, concerning cruelty and clemency, whether it is better to be loved than feared. And we hear that phrase a lot even to this day, and it comes from Machiavelli. And I think it's important where he writes, upon this question arises whether it is better to be loved than feared, or feared than loved. It may be answered that one should wish to be both, but because it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved, when of the two either must be dispensed with. Because it is asserted in general of men that they are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, covetous, and as long as you succeed, they are yours entirely. They will offer your blood, property, life, and children, as is said above. When it is need is far distant, but when it approaches, they will turn against you. And that prince, who relying entirely upon promises, has neglected other precautions, is ruined, because friendships are obtained by payments, not by greatness or nobility of mind, and may indeed be earned, but they are not secured, and in time of need they cannot be relied upon. And men have less scruple in offending one who is beloved than one who is feared. For love is preserved by the link of obligation, which, owing the baseness of men, is broken at every opportunity for their advantage. But the fear preserves you by dread of punishment, which never fails. And to me, Machiavelli is sort of assigns this worldview that sort of reminds me of that Hobbesian idea that man is a savage animal and nothing more.
Yeah.
He's very much aware of the fact that in the world of politics, you can all have a common goal or objective, or I can recognize that I work under someone else. But men and these sort of political machines and our political animals, they're going to be after the world in which their own interests are what they look out for. Men are fickle. They look out for themselves. They look out for their families. And so you need to be cruel. And by that cruelty, that means, of course, the idea of, either decapitating someone, like we mentioned with Borgia, and taking care of De Orco, or relying on the cruelty of an army or mercenary men along with your own forces to supplement your own actions. Because, he writes here, nevertheless, the prince ought to inspire fear in such a way that if he does not win love, he avoids hatred, because he can endure very well being feared whilst he is not hated. And that's what this is, all a balancing act that Machiavelli is trying to instruct upon a prince who's reading this, is that there needs to be the importance of maintaining power, being direct and effective, and keeping up with your word, and making sure that you can command men who fear you and respect you, but not necessarily hate you to where they would turn against you.
Yeah, no,
to
definitely.
add there?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, a little analogy popped in my head. It seems like according to Adam Smith, self-interest is what drives the market. But according to Machiavelli, fear is what maintains the political order. So Machiavelli recognizes absolutely that self-interest is what drives individuals. But that self-interest can be at the odds with statecraft. And in order to sort of get around that, you need to have the people and the nobility and your societal elite fear you, so that they do what you want, essentially. So on the one hand, yes, you want them to be loyal and you want them to respect you, and you don't want to be hated. So that's the main thing. You don't want to be hated, because a hated monarch is basically just is in a situation where he's one excuse away from the people backing whoever wants to overthrow him, right? So, and that also sort of goes into sort of the military aspects of the prince. So one of the reasons why Machiavelli is so hard on mercenaries is that they don't fear their client, the king who's paying them. They don't fear the king because they are the arms upon which he relies, and they have no loyalty to the king aside from at what Machiavelli says, the meager salary that he pays them. So this is one of the things that he harps on quite a bit, is his hatred of mercenaries. And the reason being is that is because of these points that we've talked about. What's valuable to a king is to be feared and respected and have loyalty from the people, and mercenaries give you none of that, essentially. So, and that's one of the big things that Machiavelli decries throughout the book, is that mercenaries he sees are largely to blame for a lot of Italy's problems, because from the invasions from France and from the Holy Roman Empire, from Spain, the mercenary armies that they had, they just, they gave way without even giving battle on the field, essentially, to hear Machiavelli tell it. So it's, I think he's absolutely right in those aspects of the Prince, where he really hones in on the value of fear and loyalty as things that a leader should strive to instill in his people. Because when he doesn't, or when he has to rely on people who don't in a fundamental way, like for national defense, that's when things can go pear-shaped real quick.
Yeah, and I mean, he talks about why the lack of loyalty is important to have, and when we talk about the military, the mercenaries especially, because he's just like, he says here when he talks about it, he says, The ruin of Italy has been caused by nothing else than resting all of her hopes for many years on mercenaries, and although they formerly made some display and appeared valiant amongst themselves, yet when the foreigners came, then they showed what they were. Thus it was Charles, the King of France, was allowed to seize Italy with chalk in hand. And he who told us that our sins were the cause told of it in truth, but they were not sins that he imagined, but those which I have related, and they were the sins of princes. It is the princes who have suffered the penalty. And I mean, there's so much to me that just rings about the realist school of thought in foreign policy that just comes from Machiavelli. And I think we can just use this as sort of a springboard to talk about like modern day applications, right? Because we look at Machiavelli and we're like, ooh, Machiavelli and like backstabbing and just sort of this ruthlessness and cruelty. But there's a lot of just brutal pragmatism, I think, that is important to when we look at him. To me, I view Machiavelli as someone who understood that you have to appease those that have their own rival interests or fair-weathered friends, which that even applies to politics, whether that's office politics or international affairs to this day. But he also talks about the ability to. He also talks a lot about military and the military spending. He talks about those who are frugal. You don't want to appear parsimonious, but at the same time, you want to be able to keep your tax base happy. That way, if need be, you can, supply the arms and the necessary ways to survive a siege and to defend yourself against others, or if necessary, to finance a campaign to expand your territory. Which are all some of the very basic things that we've talked about on this channel. Let's say things like offensive realism, right? Where you need to have the ability to have access to capital and trade so you can finance your military and project yourself to the globe or your, immediate area to maintain a hegemonic sort of sphere of influence wherever you're ruling from, whether that's here in the West or in some other part of the world. And Machiavelli, when we talk about him, I think that that's a huge part of a prince's duty, which is the ability to remove dissent, keep a balanced military that is primarily of loyal native citizenry, which, I mean, Machiavelli's life, if you know anything about him, you'll know that he raised sort of a group of like 400 farmer soldiers that were local and native born, that were of lances and small arms, that were able to, make military advances. So he practices what he preaches. And it works effectively even to this day, where we know that a reliance necessarily on guns for hire or foreign-born militaries. I mean, he cites the Romans as a fantastic example towards the end of the Roman Empire. The reliance on those who have no loyalty to, the homeland or the people will inevitably turn against you when someone with a larger pocketbook comes around. And to this day, that still stands as a fundamental truth of military application.
Yeah, no, Mercenaries. He doesn't have much nice to say about Mercenaries. I'll read from here from chapter 12. He says on Mercenaries, mercenaries and auxiliaries are useless and dangerous. If you are counting on mercenaries to defend your state, you will never be stable or secure, because mercenaries are ambitious, undisciplined, disloyal, and they quarrel amongst themselves. Courageous with friends and cowardly with enemies, they have no fear of God and keep no promises. With mercenaries, the only way to delay disaster is to delay the battle. In peacetime, they plunder you, and in wartime, they let the enemy plunder you. Why? Because the only interest they have in you and their only reason for fighting is the meager salary you're paying them. And that's not reason enough to make them want to die for you. Sure, they're happy to be your soldiers while you're not at war, but when war comes, they run for it or just disappear. So yeah, no, he's no love lost by Machiavelli on mercenaries. And as you said, he practiced what he preaches. One of his major things as sort of a diplomat for the city of Florence was he was finally able to get that citizen army that he wanted, like you were saying, and achieve with them what Florence had been trying and failing to do with mercenaries before, which I believe was the capture of the city of Pisa, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yep.
And mercenaries, if you look at mercenaries both now and in the past, the only as far as I'm aware, the only real times where they're extremely effective was within sort of specialized roles. So like having a mercenaries provide security. Even today, that's still done with like the company formerly known as Blackwater, and also here in Africa, particularly back in the 70s, there was a lot of mercenaries from Europe who are being used to in the Rhodesian Bush War along the River Zambezi, and more recently in Angola and even in Namibia. So these are, predominantly Afrikaner or European mercenary outfits of trained soldiers and whatnot. But these are a very different type of mercenary than what you would find historically in the past. These are sort of trained professionals, typically dealing with, the rebels or people who may have a lot of heart but next to no training, poorly equipped, undisciplined, untrained. So when confronted with a small mercenary detachment who does know what they're doing, they're able to be quite effective. But this is, again, not what Machiavelli's talking about. What Machiavelli's talking about is basically, sort of large pitched battles, taking territory and holding it and not having to worry about the mercenaries, being bought off and turning the tables on you when someone with a bigger wallet comes by. So in that sense, I think Machiavelli is absolutely correct. So the role for mercenaries today and in the past, I think there was a role for them, but relying on them as your primary source of national defense, as these Italian states did at the time, I do think was, profoundly foolhardy for all the reasons Machiavelli gives.
Yeah. And we've talked a lot about, what is sort of the timelessness of Machiavelli, but there's also quite a few things in here that have not aged quite as well. And I find it interesting because we spend a lot of time talking about, certain political aspects that we still quote and cite today. But today, we don't talk about mercenaries as much as we did maybe 500 years ago, because standing militaries was not as a common practice as it was, back then. The concept of a standing army isn't even a thing until the just a couple of hundred years ago, long after Machiavelli wrote this. And so a lot of time that is spent discussing the need for these alliances or the reliance on these auxiliary forces and mercenary forces doesn't age as well, I think, when we take a look at the fact that almost every nation on Earth no longer relies on auxiliaries or mercenary forces, guns for hire. They rely on a standing native military. The other thing that I find interesting is that there's this sort of this discussion about, the aspect of riches and unfortune. And of course, Machiavelli is writing about this, talking about, princes and principalities of monarchies and how that would operate. And of course, none of that exists nowadays. How many monarchies actually exist on Earth and the way that Machiavelli would envision them? Which brings me to the idea that he talks about, he argues, sometimes pondering over this, I'm in some degree inclined to their opinion. Nevertheless, not to extinguish all of our free will, I hold it true that fortune is the arbiter of one half of our actions, but that she never leaves us to direct the other half, and perhaps a little less. I compare her to one of those raging rivers when flooded overflows the plains, sweeping away the trees and buildings, bearing away the soil from place to place. Everything flies before it, and all yield to its violence, without it being in any way to withstand it. Yet through its nature and such does not follow, therefore, that men, whether the weather becomes fair, shall not make provision, both with defenses and barriers, in such manner that rising again the waters may pass away by canal, and their force neither unrestrained nor so dangerous. So when it happens with fortune, who shows her power when valor has not prepared to resist her, and thither she turns her forces when known through barriers and defenses that have not been raised to constrain her. And so this whole chapter, we're talking chapter 25 now, which is the latter half of The Prince, is sort of talking about one's character. The sort of, Christian idea of the inability to resist sin, it comes up a lot here. And I just find that interesting that we have such a secular version of this nowadays, where we're talking about, corruption and, our ability to be considered good public servants. And Machiavelli just spends so much time about, how a prince needs to be understanding about the changes of their estate and wealth, and that how you cannot let the allure of riches hold on to you today. And I don't know how I feel about it, because, there's so many of our politicians today that just grossly enrich themselves when they're in office. And it's just this, they're almost corrupted by it, the fortune and capital. And, there's just this weird alien sensation as like a 21st century reader looking at back on this, where it's just like, look at these, these commanding tomes that are telling you to not be so concerned or impulsive by the allure of riches and fortune and how that may change, when there are other things to consider, like your honor and your character. And those feel so foreign, I don't know. It just feels very strange.
Yeah. No, one of the interesting things Machiavelli talks about related to this is he says that the nobles, the goals of the nobles and of the people are often at times at odds. So the nobles, according to Machiavelli, want to pillage the people, and the people want to not be subjugated.
Yeah, they just want to get on with their day.
Yeah. They want to be, they want to live in Ancapistan, according to Machiavelli. They want to have, they want to be able to make a living and to not be, oppressed or whatever by the nobles and so on and so forth. But, the nobles the people may know or believe that there has to be some authority, but they want to be left alone as much as possible. And what Machiavelli advises the leader to do, of course, as we talked about, was, getting the people on side and whatnot. But the issue with that is he made the point very clear in a number of parts in The Prince that you can't afford to get the nobles too pissed off. And not only that, but the nobles do serve a useful function to the prince and a useful function within the kingdom. And even though they may be resented, depending on which noble we're talking about, they also often have some degree of respect and loyalty from their own subjects within their fiefdom, right? So the issue is to sort of strike the balance. So you want, for what Machiavelli advises is to allow your elites to get on with things, but you don't want to break their rice bowls, essentially. So the landed nobility, the aristocracy, I guess today, we could say it's like mega corporations or whatever. You want to allow them to sort of operate and be able to make a profit, but not sort of go too far. And this is sort of, this is one of the things where, in my own thinking about sort of modern times and today, Machiavelli is both correct and dated. And what do I mean by this? I'll start with how he's dated first. So since the liberal democratic age and the rise of the centralized nation state, politicians have figured out that they can turn the state into an enormous patronage machine for the people, right? So they can issue gibs in returns for votes, which is what you see happen time and time again, particularly in like Latin America with Perón or what was that guy's name? Hugo Chavez. Yeah. Hugo Chavez, where they're able to sort of take that peasant resentment and sort of funnel it into riding them into political, or using the people as donkeys to pull you across the finish line. And in return, you give them a payout on the back end. Now, of course, in the past, the only people who would get a payout were, the various elites within society. But now, that's not the case. So you have this weird situation, which I think is it's not entirely unique in history, right? Rome had its bread and circuses, but it was relatively unheard of in historical terms, where you would buy the people off through the public purse. So now we have an issue where, whereas in the past you had to worry about the decadent and, corrupted nobility stamping on the peasant, now we're dealing with a very large underclass in many societies who are soaking the productive people in society. So that's one of those issues. But the part where it's still true, that analysis of Machiavelli, is that we see how popular populism is, right? Where real or imagined, if the people are made to believe that there are people above them who don't have their best interests at heart, who, want to give their jobs to immigrants or whatever, or, even the whole rich aren't paying their fair share nonsense, or whatever, that sort of demagoguery that you get from the likes of a Bernie Sanders or a Hugo Chavez. And of course it varies from country to country, but that sort of resentment of the elites and being able to channel that, I think, has always been a card that a prince is able to play.
Yeah. And I mean, when we talk about, its applicability and what's timeless, I'm reminded of, like, towards the end of the book, he talks about, like, what he calls flatterers. And I'm just thinking to myself, like, I think about Donald Trump almost instantly, because he'll just endorse anybody for re-election that says something nice about him, and not whether or not they're good for the party or for, like, good on policy.
This guy, great senator, wonderful guy. He came to my hotel. He loves my hotel.
He says America first. He likes Ivanka. It all works out. Like, it bothers me.
He loves Ivanka.
Yeah, Machiavelli writes that men are so happily absorbed in their own affairs and indulge in such self-deception that it is difficult for them not to fall victim to this plague, and that some efforts to protect oneself from flatterers involve the risk of becoming despised. And I just find that so true, in that for anyone who's interested in politics, especially if you're new to it, or if you're someone who is running, right, for even like the dog catcher in your own local town, if you're, shaking hands and rubbing shoulders with the wealthy and powerful, it can be easy to find oneself falling for the attraction and the attention of those who are well-to-do in society or who are well off. And of course, even being flattered applies to virtually anything that we do, whether that's in entrepreneurship, whether you're, an ambassador for a brand, like even people who do YouTube stuff, right? Like we'll long for the attention of much bigger channels and content creators that we like. And it becomes very difficult for one not to flagellate themselves and hoping that they get the attention of other people. And it's a weird thing and people get their egos, I think, a little blown too much when they either receive money or they receive attention from things. And I think chapter 23 about flattering is very important. But even today, when we talk about sort of the patronage machine of the citizenry and, buying out the voting base, you also need to have people that can effectively run that, because if you can't effectively run your patronage machine, someone's going to subvert it from within and take over. And I'm reminded of what Machiavelli talks about when it comes to intelligence, that there are three kinds of intelligence and intelligent people to deal with. There's the intelligent kind that understands things for itself, which is great to have. The kind that understands what others can view and understand and empathize with. And then the one that you don't want to have which is the kind that does not understand for itself nor through others, so those who just aren't really around things. And he says if a prince doesn't have the first type, then he should very well at least have the second. A prince must have the discernment to recognize the good or bad when another says things, even if he has no acumen himself. And I think that that's sort of important to understand, that if you can't read people, or if you can't read that others may have an ulterior motive, then you're not long for this world and whatever you're doing, whether that's business, whether that's politics, or even just, teamwork and working with others in a group project.
No, definitely. And I think, we saw this a little bit in the recent or semi-recent political happenings going on in the United States, right? I mean, yeah, it's on the one hand with the Trump administration, he did seem to have a certain degree of discernment, let's call it. So that second set of intelligence that Machiavelli talked about, right? So in terms of his foreign policy on trade and sort of foreign relations and sort of getting through his agenda diplomatically achieved, he was able to do quite a lot from what I understand. The problem with the Trump administration was sort of with these internal issues, right? Sort of being able to sort of tell. And so it was the flatterers, like you said, and also for whatever reason, lacking either the intelligence or ability to sort of deal with the internal advice. So with the, and I guess maybe it might come down to sort of aptitude, right? So diplomatic negotiations about trade and so on and so forth. They're essentially business negotiations, fundamentally between two different nations. But, appoint this guy as head of this department. Oh, trust me, I know what I'm talking about, okay. that, and if you don't have the discernment, I mean, it's that old personnel is policy thing, right? So if you aren't in a position where you can sort of put your people into positions of power, if you don't even know what your people is supposed to look like, then you've got your work cut out for you.
Exactly. And I mean, that was the biggest thing I think that you could definitely tell with this administration, was that we fell for flatterers, and we allowed the people who talked up a big game to ride the coattails of the campaign and then get into their office respectively, and then just be exactly counterintuitive or have, previous allegiance to the system. You could almost talk, and that's the thing, right, is that if we look at like the modern political sense in the West, especially in like the United States, is that if you ever wanted to see what a definition of a political mercenary is it would be, what we would consider special interest or lobbyists. They are, for hire. They have their own interests in heart, and they're going to be whoever signs their checks, which is why like K Street has no loyalty except to K Street. And so when you have people like Mnuchin or Rex Tillerson, all these people that come from these sort of like credentialed business class lobbyists, so I spoke for so-and-so, I'm going to be a great Secretary of State. And then all of a sudden, like the campaign message that was, getting people to pay their fair share or whatever stops happening, then, we saw this revolving turnstile of just people coming in and people leaving the cabinet and their posts within that administration. If there was one thing that I think, that is Machiavellian that I can give the former president credit, I think would be his recognition that you have to have the people on your side. So, I mean, for the first time in decades, you have a populist understanding in the United States' political and electoral system. Too bad that's probably not going to happen anytime soon again, after
or ever again.
Forever again, thanks to that Time magazine article, with the fortification. But it does tell you that there was some nugget of popular opinion getting the press to talk about you all the time, and getting that image of being loved by the people, which helps, especially if you are conquering or coming from the outside of that established political system.
Yeah.
But I mean, to wrap things up, though, the Prince is still arguably timeless. If you are a realist or understand any aspect of realpolitik, um, the Prince, along with Plato's The Republic, I think are the two most like seminal foundational pieces of literature that you should read. I do have it linked in the description for the audio. And you should definitely read this in entirety if you haven't. It's a classic, and it's relatively very quick to read. I was brushing up on it over the course of the week after reading it a few months ago in preparation for the stream. And of course, Mr. Patriarch has got a great ongoing video series that you should definitely watch. With that being said, Mr. Patriarch, do you have anything that you want to plug in or shill?
Yeah, of course. Links in the description, my friend. So, yes, I have that series Prudentialist has talked about. That's sort of my second big series that I have undertaken. My first series I did was on fascism, the life and times of fascism, which is a multi-part series. So if you're interested in that, go check it out. The Prince, part 5 of my series is coming out sometime this week. Dad life had me a little bit busy this week, but yeah, part 5 is going to be on military matters within the Prince. So that will be coming out very soon. Also, at some point, I'm going to be having a stream on Orthodox Christianity. I'm not exactly sure when I'm going to be doing that, but I have a guest in mind. We just need to find a time to schedule it. Also, I've thought about I'm going to be doing another edited video on, what is it? Dang it. Oh yeah. Right-wing virtue signaling. So I also have another video that I put out on managerialism and an analysis of Moldbug and Eyes Wide Shut. So a lot of stuff over there. So if any of that stuff sounds at all interesting to you, or you just like supporting Chad characters like Prudentialist and myself, go check it out.
Fantastic. And like I said, his links are in the description, and you should definitely give him some support if you can. And Mr. Patriarch, I did make you a moderator in chat, so if you have any links that you want to plug into the chat, by all means, you can.
Oh, nice. Cool. Excellent. Yeah, I'll so how does that work? Do you just
yeah, just go ahead and put your link in the chat and you'll be good to go.
Oh, cool. Excellent. Sorry.
Yeah.
Excellent. I've never done that before. I've never been a mod. I've never been given the wrench. So well, this is
you now have the wrench.
This is a great honor for me. So there we go. Yeah, there's the link in the there's the wrench. My God. All right.
Well, there you go.
I'm going to have to we got to have wrench reciprocity here. So I'll give you a wrench sometime. So
well, I'm certainly pleased. Thank you. And so for those of you who are still here, thank you so much for listening to this wonderful conversation we've had on the Prince. The Sunday stream will be happening tomorrow at 12 o'clock Central Time. I will have Kevin Doremus on. He is a international relations professor in a university in Lithuania, and you are going to be talking about neoclassical frameworks and Russian grand strategy. It'll be a great time, so be there tomorrow at 12 o'clock Central. And then I will be back with more scripted content in the future. I think I've got a Prudent Reads in the works for you all. And I do have a video that came out just yesterday for you all to enjoy. But if you like this kind of stuff, the only thing that I ask is that you like and that you share the stuff. We got to fight these algorithms because that's what it's like to be a right-winger on YouTube. But other than that, yeah. I greatly appreciate you all stopping by. I will see you all tomorrow. Mr. Patriarch's wonderful subscribe star and his channel links are in the description. And this has been Prudent Reads number 5, The Prince with Mr. Patriarch. Take care, everybody, and be prudent.
Good night.